we end up by a quick knowledge check as usual. So section 1, compliance requirements and technical capabilities. What is compliance and governance? Cloud governance is a product of ongoing adoption effort over time, as a true lasting digital transformation doesn't happen overnight, of course. Regulatory organizations frequently publish standards, updates to help define good security practices so that organization can avoid negligence. The purpose and scope of these standards and regulations will vary, of course. The security requirements, however, can influence the decision for data protection and retention, network access, and system security. Once the business risks are mapped and converted into decisions to policy statements, the cybersecurity architect, you, will be able to establish the regulatory compliance strategy. And this strategy also takes into consideration the industry in which your organization belongs to, or the type of transactions that the organization performs. Now, a good compliance strategy needs to ensure that security controls are implemented to directly map regulatory compliance requirements. That's why it's important to have full visibility of the type of business, transactions, and overall business requirements before you establish a regulatory compliance strategy. The image on the slide demonstrates the interactions between business risk, policy and compliance, monitoring, and enforcement to create a governance strategy. During the corporate policy definition, you will need to first evaluate the business risk, which includes the investigation of current cloud adoption plans and data classification. In this phase, you will work with the business always to balance risk, tolerance, and mitigation costs. Once you establish the business risk, you will evaluate risk tolerance to inform minimally invasive policies that govern cloud adoption and manage risks. Keep in mind that in some industries, third-party compliance affects initial policy creation. And the final stage is comprised by the pace of adoption and innovation activities that will naturally create policy violations. Executing relevant processes will aid in monitoring and enforcing adherence to policies. After defining your corporate policy strategy, which includes, of course, the regulatory compliance requirements, you will need to ensure that you have a proper governance in place to stay compliant over time, as, of course, new workloads are provisioned. You can use these 5 disciplines published by Microsoft in the Cloud Adoption Framework, define corporate policy for cloud governance. Those are the main pillars for the cloud governance strategy that you can use. The following tables give us some example of operational compliance processes along with the security tools that you can use to perform them and their purpose. When planning your compliance strategy, you should take into consideration operational compliance that will support your regulatory compliance. If your organization uses vendors or other trusted business partners, one of the biggest business risks to consider may be a lack of adherence to regulatory compliance by these external organizations. So this risk often cannot be remediated and instead may require a strict adherence to requirements by all parties. You need to make sure that you have identified and understand any third-party compliance requirements before beginning a policy review. And improving operational compliance reduces the likelihood of an outage related to configuration drift or vulnerabilities related to systems being improperly patched. Now let's look at the compliance consideration one by one. Your organization may need to be compliant with one, as I mentioned, or more industry standards in some cases. Consider a health organization, for example, hospitals, doctors, health insurance, and other healthcare companies that create, receive, maintain, and transmit access to protected health information, which is known as PHI. This organization will need to be compliant with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. The regulations issued under HIPAA are a set of US healthcare laws that, among other provisions, establish requirements for the use and disclosure and safeguarding of protected health information. Now, the control, in this case, Azure Policy includes a regulatory compliance built-in initiative definition that maps to compliance domains and control in HIPAA HI Trust version 9.2. An Azure Policy regulatory compliance built-in initiative definition maps to compliance domains and control in Azure Security Benchmark. And Microsoft recently updated the Azure Security Benchmark to version 3, which is the latest version. And each control in Azure Security Benchmark is associated with one or more Azure policy definitions. As you can see in this slide, here is the list of the current available regularity standards in Azure Policy. As such, it's very important the compliant in Azure Policy refers only to the policy definitions themselves. This does not ensure you are fully compliant with all requirements of a control. In addition to the compliance standard included controls here that aren't addressed by any Azure Policy definition at this time. Therefore, compliance in Azure Policy is only a partial view of your overall compliance status. And the association between compliance domains, controls, and Azure Policy definitions for this compliance standard may change over time. So those are the latest. You need to perform also your other, for example, technical are only covered here. There are also some compliance which are not technical covered. You need to complement this with your security department and the business to make sure you are fully compliant, for example, for HIPAA and other regulatory standards. Now, section 2, how we need to see how we can use Microsoft Defender for Cloud to evaluate infrastructure compliance. As you establish the corporate policy and plan your governance strategies, we can use tools, as I mentioned, like Azure Policy. We'll see later Azure Blueprints and Microsoft Defender for Cloud, so you can enforce and automate your organization governance decisions. Let's talk first about Microsoft Defender for Cloud because it plays an important part in your governance strategy and, of course, in your exam. Now, the regulatory compliance dashboard in Microsoft Defender for Cloud shows the selected compliance standard with all the requirements, where support requirements are mapped to applicable security assessment. The status of this assessment reflects your compliance with the standard. For example, this screenshot shows PCI DSS standard in Defender for Cloud. So the regulatory compliance dashboard shows the status of all the assessment within your environment based on your chosen standard and regulations. And as you act on the recommendation and reduce risk factors in your environment, of course, your compliance posture will improve. And by using the information in the regulatory compliance dashboard in Defender for Cloud, you can improve your compliance posture by resolving recommendations directly within the dashboard here. You can select any of the failing assessment that appears in the dashboard to view the details for each recommendation. And then each recommendation includes a set of remediation steps that help you to resolve the issue. In the dashboard, you can select and choose the regulatory compliance standard you want. When reviewing the assessment, you can select a tab for a compliance standard that is relevant to you. In this example, I have selected Azure Security Benchmark, version 3. You will see which subscription the standard is applied on, and then you will see the list of all the controls for that standard. For example, here, network security. And then for the applicable control, you can view the details of passing and failing assessments associated with that control and the number of affected resources, for example, Azure storage accounts in this case. Now, some security controls will be grayed out, not available, because these controls don't have any Defender for Cloud assessment associated with them. You need to check the requirement and assess them in your environment because some of these might be process related and not technical, as I just mentioned. Does not mean if you are full green here, you are compliant with HIPAA and ISO, for example. The regulatory compliance dashboard will help you to focus on your attention on the gaps in the compliance with your chosen standards and regulation from the technical perspective. Now, to track your progress over time, you can use workbooks in Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and this particular workbook called Compliance Over Time. This is a great way to see how your compliance has changed over time. You can, of course, use it to see the most recent relevant information. But to me, the power here is to see whether you are improving your compliance posture or not. In this screenshot, I have selected Azure Security Benchmark for my subscription. It shows that I have quite some room for improvement here. So this is how the compliance workbook looks like. And to add this workbook, it's not available by default. You need to import it to the Defender for Cloud environment. So I have included the URL in the lower left, right corner of the slide, so you can import it to your environment. Now moving to Azure Policy to discuss the best practices on how to validate a new policy definition. This section is very important, as I mentioned before, because continuous monitoring is important for organizations that are adopting cloud computing, since the nature of workload in the cloud is very dynamic. Because new workloads are provisioned on daily basis or weekly basis, it becomes critical to ensure that these workloads are secure by default. So Azure Policy, as I mentioned, will help you to set guardrails throughout your resources to help ensure cloud compliance, avoid misconfigurations, and consistent resource governance. So by designing a tailored policy, you can help to reduce the time necessary to audit your environment by having all your compliance data in a single place. When you design an Azure policy, you need to consider how the policies will affect your Azure resources to business standards and meet compliance needs. When people, processes, or pipelines create or update resources in Azure, Azure Policy reviews each request. We have 7 Azure Policy definition effects, which are listed here. So when the policy definition effect is set to modify, append, or deploy if not exists, policy alters the request or adds to it. And when the policy definition effect is set to audit, or audit if not exists, policy causes an activity log entry to be created for new and updated resources. And when the policy definition effect is set to deny, policy stops the creation or modification of the request. For example, deploying a storage account in a specific region, and the user tries to deploy it in another region, we can deny the deployment. The disabled effect is useful for testing situation or when the policy definition has parameterized the effect. So those are the Azure policy definition effect that you can use. Now let's talk about the 4 steps and the recommended approach to validate a new policy definition in your environment. We start first by tightly define your policy. This step is accomplished by identifying the requirements and determining the resource properties. It is also important to see beyond the narrow definition of your business policy. For example, does your policy state all your virtual machine must have a certain size or deployed in a specific region? What about, for example, other Azure services like make use of virtual machines or AKS clusters? So when you define the policy, you must consider how this policy impacts resources that are used by other services. And for this reason, your policy definitions should be as tightly defined and focused on the resources and the properties you need to evaluate for compliance as possible. Next, the next step is to audit existing or new resources. This step gives you a chance to evaluate the compliance result of new policy on existing and new resources without impacting workflow. So you check that no compliant resources are marked as non-compliant, false positive, and that all the resources you expect to be non-compliant are marked correctly. After the initial subset of resources validated as expected, you can slowly expand the evaluation to all existing resources. And evaluating existing resources in this way also provides an opportunity to remediate non-compliant resources before full implementation of the new policy. And this cleanup can be done manually or through a remediation task if your policy definition effect has deploy, if not exist, definition. After completing validation of your new policy definition with both existing resources and the new or updated resource request, you begin the process of implementing your assignment the policy. It is recommended to create the policy assignment for new policy definition to a subset of all the resources first, such as a resource group. So after validating the initial deployment, we can extend the scope of the policy to broader and broader levels, such as subscription and management groups. So you start small scale, you evaluate first on small set of resources, and then you can widen the scope level. This expansion is achieved by removing the assignment and creating a new one of the target scopes until it is assigned to the full scope of resources intended to be covered by your new policy definition. And any changes to the scope, changes could be on the level side or exclusions, should be fully validated and communicated with your security and compliance department to ensure there are no gaps in the coverage. You need to make sure that all is covered, all the resources are covered by Azure Policy. And the last step with Azure Policy is to monitor your policy and compliance, because assigning your policy definition is not the final step. It is also recommended to evaluate the policy definition and related assignment on a scheduled basis to validate the policy definition if it's meeting the business policy and compliance needs. Policies should be removed, of course, if not longer are needed. And you also need to update policies from time to time, because as the underlying Azure resources evolve and add new properties and capabilities. So if you created a custom policy, you need to make sure that it is always up to date, because the resources are also get new features added on a regular basis. So those are the 4 steps to validate a new Azure Policy definition. Now moving to design data residency requirements. Here, when designing your data residency solution, one common requirement is regarding data sovereignty. While it implies data residency, it also introduces rules and requirements that define who has control over and access the data stored in the cloud. In many cases, data sovereignty mandates that customer data be subject to the laws and legal jurisdiction of the country or the region in which data resides. And these laws can have direct implications on data access, even for platform maintenance or customer-initiated support requests. And as you know, most Azure services are deployed regionally, which enable you to specify where the data will be stored and processed. Examples of such regional services include virtual machines, storage accounts, and SQL databases. And to maintain resiliency, Microsoft uses a variable network path that sometimes crosses geo-boundaries. However, replication of data between regions is always transmitted over encrypted network connections. Now, what solution or solutions can you use for data residency? You can restrict data and resources to certain Azure region. As I mentioned, you can use the allowed location in your Azure policy, that you can target specific region to respect the data residency requirements of your company. Once policies are established, not only will new resources that are deployed will be checked against the policies, but all the resources will be periodically scanned to help ensure ongoing compliance. Now, another option to take into consideration for data residency is the use of Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints different from Azure Resource Manager and Azure Policy, in that Blueprints is a package that contains different types of artifacts, including ARM templates, resource groups, policy assignment, and role assignments. All of them are packaged in one container, so you can quickly and easily deploy all of these components in a repeatable configuration. And Blueprints can help you to simplify large-scale Azure deployment by packaging policies in a single blueprint definition. This is the Azure Blueprint. Now, on the data storage side, if you want to ensure your data is stored only in your chosen geography, you should select data storage for regional service. Most Azure services are deployed regionally and enable you to specify the region into which the service will be deployed, for example, storage account. Your data in a storage account is always replicated to help ensure durability and high availability. And Azure Storage copies your data to protect it from transient hardware failure, network power outages, and even massive natural disasters. You can typically choose to replicate your data within the same data center, 3 copies using local redundant storage, across availability zones within the same region, or across geographically separated regions. You can configure certain Azure services to store data only in single region with certain exceptions. This includes Azure Backup, Azure Data Factory, Azure Site Recovery, and Azure Stream Analytics, and local redundant storage. For example, Azure Backup, when you create Azure Recovery Services Vault, by default is geo-redundant storage. If I create my Recovery Services Vault in West Europe, by default, I will have also copy in North Europe in the paired region. So you need to make sure that you disable the geo replication to make sure it is local redundant storage and stays with in the same region. Now, one example of non-regional service is Azure Active Directory, Azure AD. Azure AD may store identity data globally, except for Azure AD deployment in US, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Why I chose in those regions? Because of the regulatory requirements to respect GDPR. For example, in Europe, in Australia, Australia and New Zealand also they have their own requirement that we need to respect. So, United States, where identity data is stored, only in the United States. Europe, Azure AD keeps most of the identity data within European data centers, except as noted in the identity data storage for European customer in Azure Active Directory. Australia and New Zealand, also identity data is stored in Australia, except, again, as not in customer data storage for Australian and New Zealand customers in Azure Active Directory. Certain Azure services don't enable you to specify the region where services will be deployed. Those are global regions. Please check the URL for the complete list. It has the non-regional services of products available by each region. For example, Sentinel, when you enable it, you can deploy the local analytics workspace in a specific region. For example, if you deploy it in Switzerland North, everything will be in Switzerland North storage. However, there are some analytics rules will be copied to West Europe. So for EU customers, it will be copied to the West Europe and processed analytic rules in EU for GDPR, and I don't copy the data to US. Let's see now how to translate privacy requirements into requirements for security solutions. Again, to enforce privacy requirements, we need to consider using the Azure Policy. Azure Policy is deeply integrated into Azure Resource Manager, which helps you to enforce policy across resources. And with Azure Policy, you can define policy at organization level to manage resources and prevent developers from accidentally allocating resources in violation of those policies. To get before example about developers, we can use Azure Policy to make sure that developers cannot prevent, deploy, allocate resources and violate those policies. And you can also use Azure Policy in a wide range of compliance scenarios, such as ensuring that your data is encrypted or remain in a specific region to comply with GDPR or California Consumer Privacy Act, for example. Now, when you design your solution to fulfill the specific, to fulfill the privacy requirements, you need to take into consideration the state of the data at a certain point of time. For some scenarios, it may not be enough to protect the data only when the data is at rest. You may also need to protect while in transit. For example, the PCI, if you take the PCI DSS requirement, version 4, it obliges to encrypt transmission of credit card holder data across open public networks. So you can protect data based on its stage. At rest, data protection, which is encryption at rest, provides data protection for stored data. Attacks against data at rest include attempts to obtain physical access to the hardware on which the data is stored and then compromise the contained data. Remember that you are responsible for ensuring that data stored in Azure is encrypted in accordance with your standards. And Azure offers a wide range of encryption capabilities that we'll talk later about them, giving you the flexibility to choose a solution that best meets the scenario or your needs. For example, Azure Key Vault helps you to easily maintain control of keys that are used by cloud application and services to encrypt data. Azure Disk Encryption enables you to encrypt virtual machines. And Azure Storage Service Encryption makes it possible to encrypt all data placed in your storage account. And on the on-transit data protection, you can protect data in transit. It should be a very essential part of your data protection strategy because data is moving back and forth from many locations. It is strongly recommended that you always use TLS protocols to exchange data across different locations. In some circumstances, you might want to isolate the entire communication channel between your on-premises and a cloud infrastructure by using VPN. And Microsoft provides a number of options that can be utilized for securing data in transit internally within the Azure network and externally across the internet to the end users. And these include communication through the Virtual Private Network VPN, Transport Layer Protocol TLS 1.2, or later via Azure components such as Azure Application Gateway or Azure Front Doors. Now, Microsoft recently announced that now they are supporting in preview TLS 1.3 for Azure Application Gateway, which is in preview. Now, Microsoft Azure services each support one or more of the encryption at rest models. For some services, one or more of the encryption model may not be applicable. For services that support customer-managed key scenarios, they may support only a subset of the key type of that Azure Key Vault support for key encryption key. Additionally, services may release support for these scenarios and key types at different schedules. The list here on the slide shows the current encryption at rest of the major Azure data storage services. If you are using infrastructure as a services features, you can encrypt at rest IS VMs and disks through the Azure Disk Encryption. All Azure storage services, such as blob storage, queue storage, table storage, and Azure Files, support server-side encryption at rest. And some storage services, such as blob storage and Azure Files, support also customer-managed key and client-side encryption. And if you require higher level of assurance that data is secure, you can also enable 256-bit AES encryption at the Azure storage infrastructure level. So double encryption. When infrastructure encryption is enabled, so the data in storage account is encrypted twice, once at the service level and one at the infrastructure level, with two different encryption algorithms and two different keys. And double encryption of Azure storage data protects against a scenario where one of the encryption algorithm or key may be compromised. In this scenario, the additional layer of encryption continues to protect your data. An Azure SQL database currently supports encryption at rest for Microsoft managed service side and client side encryption scenarios. Support for server encryption is currently provided through the SQL feature called transparent data encryption. Encryption at rest can be enabled at the database level and at the server level, and it is enabled by default now. On the client-side encryption of Azure SQL database, data is supported through the always encrypted features. Always encrypted uses a key that is created and stored by the client. You can store the master key in the Windows Certificate Store, Azure Key Vault, or in your local hardware security module, HSM. And by using SQL Server Management Studio, you can choose what key you would like to use to encrypt which column. This is a potential exam question. You might need to encrypt a single column of data, which option you use. Now, another important security practice to call out is data classification. You will see it multiple times mentioned in this course, because security controls that you will apply to the data will vary according to the level of privacy required by the data. And to ensure that you are prioritizing the data that is important to be secure, you will need to classify your data. Data classification is a way of categorizing data assets by assigning a unique logical label or classes to the data assets. Classification is based on the business context of the data, of course. For example, you might classify assets by passport number, drive license number, credit card, Swift code, and so on. And one solution for data classification in Azure is Microsoft Purview. Formerly, it was called Azure Purview, but now it's Microsoft Purview. It is a unified data governance service that helps you to manage and govern your on-premises, multi-cloud, and software-as-a-service data. You can create a holistic, up-to-date map of your data landscape with automatic data discovery, sensitive data classification, and end-to-end data lineage. It also allows you to enable data custodians to manage and secure your data and empower data consumers to find valuable data. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, in public preview, maybe it will not be included in the exam, but it's good to know that they introduced what they call shared data near real time with Microsoft Purview. They call it in-place data sharing for Azure storage, so the data won't be copied to the target data consumer. So you are the data provider, and the partner who can access the data based on your invitation is called data consumer. Today, this is only available for Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2 and a blob storage account in Microsoft Purview. And the provider and consumer storage account must be in the same Azure region. Data can be shared from Data Lake Storage Generation 2 to Data Lake Storage Generation 2, or from blob to blob storage account. This will allow you to collaborate with external partner or third-party ISVs to automate data sharing and to put expiry date as part of your data governance solution. So keep an eye on Microsoft Purview. It's getting evolving, and it's a very important product. Now, one important aspect of privacy is to ensure that you have a system to protect the user identity, because a compromise, as I mentioned, identity could lead to that data compromise and directly affect the privacy requirement for your project. Again, consider use the Azure AD identity protection. Again, is part of P2 license to enhance your identity protection strategy and ensure you are fulfilling the privacy requirements. Identity protection uses the learning Microsoft has acquired from their positioning in organizations, Azure AD, from the consumer space, and from the different customers. They analyze trillions of signals per day to identify and protect users from threats. And the signals generated by and fed to identity protection, you can be further fed into like conditional access to make access decision, or fed back to the security operation, information management like SIM, in Sentinel, for example, for further investigation. So you can get the signals from identity protection and send them to conditional access or to Sentinel. All right. I see. Any questions so far before we move into the next, which is the last objective, actually, in the second module? Let's see. We have audio. Audio is, I think. Okay, we have a question about any hands-on practice in the course. There is no actually hand-ons in the course, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's not a technical exam. You will not see how to do things. There is no performance lab questions, nothing at all. Most of them are case studies and choose the solution. They give you requirements, technical requirements, security requirements, and you need to choose. So there is no practice in the exam. Okay, since Microsoft is managing the cloud infrastructure, how much responsibility lies with Microsoft? Does life become easy for customers now as compared to the on-premises days? Well, this very good question, because moving to the cloud does not mean that you are safe or you don't have any more to do your homework. As we know, it is always shared responsibility models. There are some parts that Microsoft are in charge of them, and some part you as a customer, as user, you are also charged to secure your data. For example, storage account, you deploy storage account, it's public endpoint by default, and you need to secure it to make sure it's on HTTPS. You need to protect it, make it private endpoints, to make sure it's not publicly accessible. The keys are not accessible. We'll talk about storage later. So you are in charge of the data, of course. The infrastructure, of course, is managed by Microsoft and secured by Microsoft, in which region no one can enter. It's very, the physical data center protection is huge. And personally, I believe it's easy compared to on-premises days with the cloud from the infrastructure perspective, from servers, entrance to data centers, and so on. And all the logs which are available in the cloud really make it easier, but you need to do your homework. So it's not by default there. You need to make sure that all security logs are generating, and you have a continuous monitoring in process and alert in place. Another question about GDPR. We talk about data residency and data sovereignty requirements, which is included. Based on the requirement case study, you may see that in which region you deploy to respect the privacy of GDPR, then yes, Microsoft Cloud is GDPR compliant, and all their services, they can be respected. For example, here in Switzerland, we are not in the EU, we don't have GDPR, we have something similar to GDPR. And for this reason, Microsoft they open almost an Azure region in every country to respect the local or the EU or the US and other privacy requirements. Okay, let's now move to the last objective in Module 2 about evaluating security posture. So we start by evaluating security posture by using benchmarks. And governance in the cloud must have an active component that continuously engages with other teams. And security posture management is an emerging function. It represents a step forward in the long-term coverage of security functions. And these functions answer the question, how secure is my environment, including vulnerability management and security compliance reporting. You will see in the next few slides that Microsoft Defender for Cloud is the security solution that you can use to evaluate and improve your security posture. A quick word about security posture. Security posture refers to the current state of an organizational security and the overall state of protection of its identities, endpoints, user data, apps, and infrastructure. The three pillars of security posture management are protect, detect, and respond. This cycle. The protect side, security posture is not static. It changes constantly and in response to emerging new threats and variabilities in the environment. For example, when you enable protection like MFA, multi-factor authentication for administrator, it strengthens the company's posture. A lack of vigilance, such as failing to update endpoints or use available protection, can weaken an organization's security posture. So the security hygiene of your environments help to reduce the likelihood that threat actors will successfully compromise your workloads. On the detect side, after mitigating all security recommendations detected by the Defender for Cloud, you can also ensure that you have threat detection in place to quickly identify suspicious activities in your workloads and trigger an alert to bring awareness about it. And then respond, you need to ensure that you have an automation in place to take immediate action on the alert that you receive by appropriately respond to it with an action that can contain and mitigate the attack. And to improve the security hygiene of the cloud workloads, you also need to ensure that you are using security best practices to harden these workloads. Each workload has different set of security best practices that must be in place to improve its security hygiene. So it is your responsibility. Make sure to check the URL in the lower right corner of the slide for more information about security best practices for Azure workloads. Now, Azure Security Benchmark is at version 3 today, and is surfaced in Microsoft Defender for Cloud regularity compliance dashboard, as you can see here in the screenshot. This benchmark gives you visibility of which security recommendations are open for compliance control. And under each applicable compliance control, you have a set of assessments run by Defender for Cloud that are associated with that control. If they are all green, it means those assessments are currently passing. This does not ensure you are fully compliant with that control, as I mentioned before. Furthermore, not all controls for any particular regulation are covered by Defender for Cloud assessments, and therefore this report is only a partial view of your overall compliance status. While this is a preferred benchmark for Azure, you may need to use a different benchmark according to the scenario that you will see in the exam. You can navigate through different tabs that has a regularity standard assigned to it to visualize the applicable compliance control that were assessed and the current status of each item. I will take a quick question here. Someone mentioned, is there any replay session afterwards? Yes, the session are being recorded and will be shared with you, with everyone, after 24 hours. Now, you can also leverage Azure Security Benchmark to identify the resources that are in risk and enable security capabilities to mitigate these risks based on the remediation steps suggested by the benchmark that you are working with or selecting. Notice that in this example, you have a security control called DP3, encrypt sensitive data in transit. And within this control, you have a series of security recommendations for different workloads: storage account, web application, virtual machines, and servers. The advantage of this approach is that you are mitigating a specific scenario, which is the encryption of sensitive data in transit. And you are looking at this scenario across different workloads. And as a cybersecurity architect, you need to select the appropriate security capabilities for a given risk, which you may conclude that for certain scenarios, the security capability may be the addition of a new service. And there are also the scenarios that you will need to select the appropriate security control for a given risk. And in this case, the security control may be just hardening the current resource. An example could be to reduce the risk of an attacker compromised database by hardening the database and enabling security controls such as transparent data encryption, TDE, and Azure SQL. This enables you to encrypt data at rest without changing any existing applications. Now, section 2, moving to evaluate security posture using Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Defender for Cloud, as I mentioned, continually assess your resources, subscriptions, and workload to find security issues. It aggregates all the findings into a single secure score. And for security analysts, it is essential to identify the potential risks associated with security recommendations and understand the attack vectors so they can prioritize more effectively. And to make prioritization easier, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, as I mentioned before, maps its security recommendation against the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques based on real-world observations. By using this capability, you can strengthen the security posture of your environment with recommendations that are mapped to this framework and prioritized based on the potential risk across the cyber kill chain. The advantage of using the MITRE ATT&CK when evaluating your security posture is that you can create campaigns to remediate recommendation based on different phases of this framework, as we talked before in the kill chain. The foundation is that if you remediate recommendations that are mapped to an early stage of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you can prevent a threat actor from gaining further access to your workloads. Now, the Secure Score dashboard under Security Posture in Defender for Cloud shows the secure score on the subscription level for one or more subscription, depending on how many subscriptions you select in the Azure portal. In this example, I have 68 subscriptions. When you use Secure Score as your key performance indicator, KPI, you can track progress as you continuously remediate security recommendations to drive your Secure Score up. And when a company doesn't have a very mature Azure governance, chances that they will experience a fluctuation in the Secure Score up and down, up and down. And this can happen if you continue provisioning new resources that are not secure by default. And by having a solid Azure governance in place, you can use Azure Policy, enables you to ensure that new resources that are deployed are going to have certain standards, patterns, and configuration during deployment. I talked previously about this. You can leverage Azure Policy and Azure Blueprints to ensure proper governance. This will allow you to enforce policies and reject deployment of resources that are not following certain standards. Now, this example shows the recommendations, a dashboard in Microsoft Defender for Cloud with all security controls organized in a top-down list. where the controls on top will have a higher impact on the secure score improvement. And to increase your security, you need to review Defender for Cloud's recommendation page and remediate the recommendation by implementing the remediation instruction for each issue discovered. Recommendations are grouped into security controls, and each control is a logical group of related security recommendation and reflects your vulnerable attack surfaces. Your score only improves when you remediate all the recommendations for a single resource within a control. You can review the scores for each security control to see how well you are securing each individual attack surface. Now, in many scenarios, the IT security admin does not have the right level of privileges in the workload to accelerate the remediation of recommendations. And when a user doesn't have the right level of privilege in the workload and tries to remediate a recommendation by using the fix button, they will have the same experience as shown in this screenshot, where the fix button is grayed out. We can solve the lack of privilege by using workflow automation that I will talk about in the next slide, which is available in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. For this reason, workload owner must be able to receive notification when there are open security recommendations for them to remediate. So how do we do this in this case? In Defender for Cloud, we can leverage the workflow automation capability to activate actions such as sending an email to the resource owners. In a big organization, big departments, for every application, there is a different resource owner. When a recommendation is triggered, they will receive an email. An example of this workflow is shown here in this diagram. The team that is responsible for Microsoft Defender for Cloud identify there is a security recommendation that needs to be addressed and which resources are affected. A ticket is open in Jira, for example, or ServiceNow, and assigned to the workload owner. In this ticket, they have details about the security recommendation and the suggested steps to remediate. The workload owner reviews the ticket and identifies that there is a quick fix for this recommendation. They can use the View Remediation Logic button to understand what changes will be made to the system before they fix it. Once they feel comfortable with the changes, they start a change management process to schedule the remediation. Then the remediation is applied on the day that was scheduled. Again, this is a potential exam question. Now, this screenshot, here are the quick steps to define a new workflow automation in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. It has separate dedicated blade where you add a workflow automation. You select which subscription, the resource group, the data, recommendation, or alert, and then you choose the recommendation state, unhealthy, and you choose your action to select the proper logic app or the automation that you want to run behind. So this is a very powerful tool in Microsoft Defender for Cloud to be used. All right, the next section in Module 2 is Design Security for an Azure Landing Zone. We talked about this at the beginning, landing zone. Let's see now more details about it. So what is Azure Landing Zone? A quick word. It is a zone where actually output of multi-subscription Azure environment that accounts for scale, security governance, networking, and identity. And landing zones enables application migration, modernization, and innovation at enterprise scale in Azure. These landing zones consider all platform resources that are required to support the application portfolio that you might have and don't differentiate between infrastructure service or platform as a service. A landing zone is an environment for hosting your workloads. It is pre-provisioned through infrastructure as a code, such as ARM templates, Bicep, or Terraform, for example. The tools you can use to deploy infrastructure as a code is, for example, Azure Pipelines and Azure DevOps, or GitHub Actions. Now, when designing and implementing an Azure landing zone, security should be a consideration throughout the entire process. And the security design area focuses on consideration and recommendation for landing zone decisions. You can use the secure methodology in the Cloud Adoption Framework, CAF, that I talk about, that also provides further in-depth guidance for holistic security processes and tools. This design area creates a foundation for security across your Azure, hybrid, and multi-cloud environments. It is involved roles or functions. The Cloud Platform and the Cloud Center of Excellence in the organization are required to review the networking and identity decisions. The collective roles might be required to define and implement the technical requirements coming from this exercise. And more advanced security guardrails might also need to support from cloud governance. Then the goal of this exercise is to understand security requirements and implement them consistently across all workloads in your cloud platform. The primary scope of this exercise focuses on security operations tooling and access control. This scope includes zero trust, that we talk about, and advanced network security. And also, out of scope, this exercise focuses on the foundation for a modern security operations centers in the cloud. To streamline the conversation, this exercise doesn't address some of the disciplines in the Cloud Adoption Framework secure methodology. Security operations, asset protection, and innovation security will build on your Azure landing zone deployment. However, they are out of scope for this design area discussion. You can enhance this foundation later on with security guidance as outlined in the Cloud Adoption Framework secure methodology. I shared the URL also here that you can go get more details, information about the secure methodology that the Cloud Adoption Framework uses. Next, I mentioned that you must have visibility into what's happening within your technical cloud workloads. And security monitoring and audit logging of Azure Platform Services is a key component of scalable framework. When it comes to security operations design, you need to make sure to review the security alerts. For example, which teams require notification for security alerts? Security information event management integration with Micro Defender for Cloud and Microsoft Sentinel. In multi-cloud scenarios, you can connect Defender for Cloud with Amazon, AWS, and Google GCP. The screenshots here shows that you can connect those environments with Azure as well. Security logs, data retention period for audit data. For example, Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Premium reports have a 30-day retention only, so long-term archiving of tools, of logs like Azure Activity Logs, virtual machine logs, and so on, we can use Azure Log Analytics up to 2 years, or archive the logs up to 7 years of data retention. Again, based on the compliance of the policy, how long you need to keep the logs so you can go back and investigate if any incident happened. Security controls is baseline security configuration via Azure in-guest VM policy. And the vulnerability management is vulnerability assessment of VMs and patching. And the shared responsibility, who are the handoff for teams' responsibility? These responsibilities need consideration when monitoring or responding to security events. Last, we have the encryption and keys, who require access to keys in the environment, who will be responsible for managing those keys. Now you can use the Azure Landing Zone Accelerator to help you accelerate, to help you create a landing zone with security by design. Security is at the core of the Azure Landing Zone Accelerator. And as part of the Landing Zone Accelerator implementation, many tools that you can see here and controls that are listed will be deployed to help you quickly achieve the security baseline. All these security tools and policies are included, so you can directly create Azure Landing Zone using the Zone Accelerator, and you will have the security by design tools and the policy as part of the landing zone to make sure that your landing zone is secure at the beginning. Always remember of secure by design, secure by default. Moving into the